we were just talking about, podcasting generally and how it's like sometimes there's basically a lot of different ways to do it. And I was saying, with Purple People, with Pod of Jake, my normal podcast, I've been doing for years, that I already tried to keep that lightweight, because in terms of the post-production and editing and stuff, because the editing and then like drafting a tweet and all that stuff is just like sort of heavyweight for me. Whereas the before part of preparation or whatever and getting guests and then having the actual conversation, that's all like really fun. Like I can do that forever for the rest of my life. But the post production and all that, it like sort of wears on me. It feels like work, and it's, I don't, it's not as sustainable. I'm not as confident that it's sustainable. And then so I was going to say, you were talking a little about Higher FM and your process. And the thing that's kind of interesting to me is like Higher FM, like I'm not just saying this, it's really one of the most interesting and like for my personal taste, like best produced podcasts that I've listened to. There are a couple of others that have done some interesting things, I think, over the years, but it's kind of like astounding that with something as popular as podcasts, they've remained so like primitive, basically, where, it's like the fact that I can do this the way that I'm doing this, and it's just a conversation. There's not even any intro music or outro music. Like there's no editing, all of that. And that it's not like the worst podcast ever. Like speaks to how primitive the sort of baseline is, like a Joe Rogan or a Lex Friedman or whatever. Like it's pretty much the same thing. They might have some intro music or whatever, but it's like a pretty low bar. And so I think there's like so much room to innovate for people who are willing to put in that post-production work. And, with Higher FM, like the fact that you weaved it together almost to be like a modern version of a radio station with the interview piece, but also interspersed with the music. Like, I love that, especially for like running. We talked about this, or at least we casted about this, that it's like the perfect complement because you want a little music when you're running to like get the adrenaline going and whatnot. But I don't like running to pure music. Like I like to have an interesting conversation to sort of like get in and kind of forget that I'm running. So anyway, maybe you can speak to like your experience with Higher FM and, doing that more heavyweight post-production, like how you thought about that in the beginning, how your thoughts might have changed, stuff like that.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me on and for the kind words about Higher FM. I definitely feel you. The post-production piece, I started to burn out. It was a much bigger lift than I thought it was going to be. And part of that, I think, is my level of expectation within myself and what I produce and what I release. I want it to be high quality and I want it to sound polished and very intentional and thoughtful. And I think, it is kind of counterculture to podcast culture in general, as you were saying. Conversations are beautiful. I think it's the human aspect of it, of an auditory format where you hear the tones and the textures and the inflections in people's voices, and that can be enough. Like it doesn't have to be anything more than a simple conversation. But I wanted to test something and I wanted to innovate, with adding music in. And I came across, some hurdles for sure. I realized pretty quickly that I was going to be doing double the effort because I wanted to mint the episodes Onchain, which meant not minting them with the music because I don't own the rights to a lot of the music that are broadcast on the episodes. So that ended up being double the production on the back end, and which was totally fine. I think in the long run, I wanted that piece. I wanted it reflected on chain and also broadcast mode. And to your point about running, I absolutely agree with you. When I am listening to just music or just a podcast that's conversation only, my brain starts to tune out and then I start to get into the like, oh, this is a long run.
How much
How
longer?
much further? Yeah, exactly. And there's just something of the cadence of mixing it up with conversation and music that it keeps my brain activated and in a different place where I can really get into flow. And So that's something that I love that we share that, and both enjoyed that aspect of it. Um, but yeah, I really have enjoyed what I've created so far. I've worked on Higher FM now for about 7 months. I started last May and started recording the episodes and started working on some of the assets. And funny enough, I've had 2 or 3 conversations in the last month where people thought I had an entire team working with me.
Uh-huh.
And I don't. I have some DJs that record mixes. Everything else has been, mostly me and some artists that have contributed their art. Um, yeah. And so I was kind of taken aback by that because I thought, it was too centered. Like I was too centered in it. But again, most of that is from what I see from behind the scenes. And to know that it's not coming across that way was really exciting. Um, because that's something I envision for this next year for sure, where Higher FM is going to go.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the point around like team, because I feel like all of the, all your favorite podcasters, not you as in like you, but just anyone, they the person is the host, obviously, like they're the one in the conversation. But I feel like an innovative podcast, something like Higher FM, really is something that sort of warrants a full team, unless you're going to do it, like almost full time, if not like completely full time. For podcasting to be the sort of part-time, more hobby-like thing that it is for a lot of podcast hosts, I feel like you would need that level of sort of like hobby-like side thing, like commitment from maybe 2 or 3 people, at least 2, where one is sort of, doing what I'm doing, and then just, basically the full scope of work that I do for a Pod of Jake episode or Purple People episode. Like that's a one-man job. But then the piece that you're basically doing both. You're doing what I do, plus you're doing like a pretty intensive post-production process. And I feel like really like a pairing of someone who does, gets the guests, does the prep and records the episode, and then hands it off to someone who like actually has a passion for whether it's music and interweaving music, just editing and putting in sound effects and like doing things, inserting clips and whatnot that are interesting, and just sort of add to the audio experience overall. And then even like if you wanted to have, another person, maybe there's someone in there who's like, maybe you actually have sort of like a full-time musician who's like making music for each episode or something like that. But to have like all of that on one person, to me, like it is for you for Higher FM, it's a lot. Like it's just a lot of work, basically.
It really is. And even with terrestrial radio, most radio stations have a full team behind the scenes. So you have the show hosts, and then there's in-studio producers that are actively working on the show as it's airing. When I worked in terrestrial radio, we were we had a skeleton crew. So we did all of it. There were 4 of us that ran the station. We were the hosts, we were the DJs, we were like producers, we did all of it. And so I think that's why I took on the challenge. I was like, well, I know what to do. I did it. And then in hindsight, I'm like, okay, I actually need a little bit of support. I need some help with some of this so that I don't burn out,
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally agree with you on that one.
So how did it break down? First of all, like how long, I knew from previous conversation that you had a background in radio, which really went a long way toward explaining why Higher FM was of the quality that it was. Like I remember I listened, I think the first episode was with Light. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I remember listening to that and just being like, wow, like it really, the phrase is a little bit overused maybe, but it like hit different. Like you listen to a podcast, and again, like some people might have better or worse intro, outro music. Some people might, edit out the uhs and the ums and have it be more of like a choppy, fast paced conversation, whereas others might leave it more raw and uncut, sort of like how I do. But those changes are sort of like on the margins. At least I don't really think they impact the overall experience like too much. But what you had done, I was like, this is actually fully produced podcast here, and like not even, it's almost a disservice to even call it a podcast given the sort of norm of podcasts as we talked about them, where this is more like a radio show. And so I remember like shortly after that, I think we spoke and you told me about your background in radio. I was like, okay, that all, like, I was very confused, and also just like your hosting abilities. I was just like very confused, and I was like, okay, that actually makes more sense. Like, we're not dealing with a rookie here, far from it. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about your radio experience, and like how, I'm curious, like how that team actually broke down in terms of like specific responsibilities and how it all like sort of came together for the output.
Yeah. It's funny. I was hosting, Twitter spaces and conversations on, there's a now defunct app that I was using during quarantine in 2020 and like 2021. And I think Twitter Spaces launched in 2021, but I had been using this other app, and it was basically like conversations for people to come together for self-care. And excuse me, I started hosting there and kind of got my hosting legs a little bit. I've always been a performer, and so it was easy for me to just kind of jump in and start conversations. I love having conversations with people. And through that, I had asked one of my DJ peers to be a guest. And from that conversation, he asked me to come audition as a morning radio show host for the station he was working with.
Mm.
And so that's how that came into play. And it was, really quick. It was totally out of left field. I never expected to be on the radio. Um, and funny enough, my family had moved. And then during quarantine, we like came back and we were staying with family. Like, okay, well, we were kind of living on the go. We were just traveling and enjoying life, and um, came to quarantine with family. And so we were kind of like, we're here, but we're not here. So a lot of people didn't know that we were like back in Salt Lake City. And then suddenly my face is on billboards and I'm on public radio. So it was kind
Was
of an
this like
interesting
a
transition.
relatively popular like Salt Lake City station?
Yeah. It
Oh wow.
it's now folded, which is a really big bummer. That was part of what the core team was trying to push, was like really save this station. It was Utah's only hip hop station.
Huh.
And yeah, that folded in let's see, middle of 2022, I think. Um, and so yeah, we had about, 100 to 150,000 listeners. It was really incredible. It was a really big piece of the community, and it had been around for 20 something years, almost 25 years. So it was kind of a staple. Um, and I was getting messages from friends I hadn't talked to in a long time. I had siblings that were getting text messages like, "Is your sister on the radio?" So it's kind of funny. And my co-host was the program director for the station. And so he was the liaison between labels and like the media conglomerate that owned the station. And that's because of that, I really learned a lot. I had already been working in the music industry since 2008, and that opened my eyes to a lot of how everything functions, and all of the major label money that used to be pumped into terrestrial radio was being pumped into streaming services. So they used to wine and dine the program directors to get, the music played on their station. And that turned into wining and dining the curators on Spotify, um, to get plays on Spotify instead. So it was
Hmm.
this really interesting transition of like radio and digital streaming platforms, and just seeing the underbelly of how everything worked, and everything really was pay to play. Um, and just, how artists were treated, and maybe didn't even know what was happening behind the scenes with regard to their label and the music and the stations and whatnot. So it opened my eyes a lot to the industry. It was definitely a different realm. Um, so my co-host was the program director, and then both of us produced every show and recorded live. And And then about halfway through, I would say probably 3 or 4 months, maybe not halfway, about 3 or 4 months after we had been recording live, we started pushing to podcasts. Um, Unfortunately, when the station folded, like everything disappeared. So my entire portfolio from that time, like vanished when the station folded,
Hmm.
which was it was very telling. And also it really ignited that flame of like, okay, ownership really is important. Like we need to own our media, we need to own our data. Like it pushed me even further into blockchain because I realized the importance of the longevity of it. If nothing else, you have the receipts. And
Right.
yeah, I thought that was really important. So, um,
Telling in what way about the, it makes sense that it pushed you like further towards blockchain and just sort of like the permanence of media, the fact that no one can just centrally decide to take it down for whatever reason. But
mhm.
was there something like, why did they take it down?
I honestly don't know. I think probably because they just canceled everything across the board as far as subscriptions and, um,
Posting and whatnot.
yeah. And last I checked, it was just all gone.
Yeah, it is a shame because I know, like, for me, having this log of episodes that, you know, not only I can listen to at any time, but anyone can listen to it anytime. I don't know how, like, I feel radio probably is a little more timely than podcasts. Like, all else equal, there's probably radios that are completely, like radio stations or programs that are completely intended to be like totally timeless. And then there's some that are, really only relevant that day. And then there's a whole spectrum of in between. And the same with podcasts, but I feel like podcasts probably tend to be a little more like the average podcast is probably more timeless, less timely versus the average radio, which, might be talking about current events and the weather or whatever, which also, a podcast might also be doing current events and stuff like that. But um, there's, I'll put it this way. There's a lot of episodes that I recorded like, 3 years ago that are still, to me, like very interesting to go listen back to, because we're not talking about anything related to what's going on, what's going on now. It's sort of like this conversation so far, like there's elements of it that are somewhat timely. Like we're talking about the pandemic, which is like, a couple-year-old reference, like in 30 years, it's not going to be like that meaningful or whatever, but, and it's sort of reflecting upon a certain point in time. But we're also talking about like, broader, broader things that would be just as interesting to listen to in 3 years as they are today. And so the fact that I have this like library that I've built, that, I can go back to listen to and anyone in the world can stumble upon at any time if they find maybe they're sort of like obsessed with one of my guests and then they go and in listening to all the podcasts they've ever done, they find my podcast and they're like, hey, I kind of like that. And then they decide to listen to some more. Like they can go listen to like 100 or 200 podcasts and like you just do whatever they want. And it's just a shame to have that you work, you put a lot of time into that and for that to like just disappear for a reason that you don't even know is like just a shame.
Yeah, it really was. It was kind of a bummer. And I have maybe a handful of, clips, and I have one full episode. Um, I actually interviewed the founders of Boss Beauty's the NFT project on the radio. Um, I think it was like 3 weeks after they launched. It would have been like September 2021.
Mm.
And the next day, one of their art pieces was hanging in the New York Stock Exchange. And so it was kind of cool to have like that interview as their first media interview. And then they shared like we have something exciting tomorrow that's happening. And then they unveiled their art in the New York Stock Exchange. And so that was pretty cool. And for a long time, I didn't think that I had it. And then I stumbled across it and was pretty excited. I still have that file. So still might have to publish that one day.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know, I mean, now it sounds like you've learned from that and you've got higher FM completely under your control, making sure that it's on chain so that it can't go anywhere. And I'm hopeful that the content that you build from here forward will be accessible for a very, very long time for anyone who wants to get into it. I usually actually start these with, just getting sort of like the full story from, the guest, just for the sake of sort of like context, for listeners and for myself to learn something as well. And we just kind of jumped right in here, but a couple of sort of threads to pull on. You mentioned you've been in music since 2008, and you've always been a performer. So maybe we started with sort of some of the recent history, Higher FM and the radio station, but maybe we can wind it back to what were you doing in music for a little more than a decade, it sounds like, and then what you mean by that you've always been a performer.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I grew up as a classically trained musician, so I was in piano lessons before school when I was in elementary school. Um, my two older sisters were in piano, and I loved watching them play. And I had to be 5 years old in order to start piano lessons.
Hmm.
And so I waited. I remember waiting until I was 5, and I was finally old enough. And I went to my first lesson, and my hands were too small, and my teacher sent me away and said, "You need to come back next year." And I was devastated. And so I took it very seriously, and just grew up, doing like concerts and recitals and competitions within piano. And then when I turned 13, I started vocal lessons and joined like school choir and stuff like that, and really enjoyed singing and performing um, in that way. And just through my high school and yeah, through high school years, I did a lot of vocal competitions. And then I got to a point where my piano teacher said, you either need to go to a more advanced teacher or like, I really don't have anything else to teach you. And I was like 17. And so I was like, I think I'm good. And I was definitely more social, and I thought I've learned what I need to. And so I kind of took a break from performing and stuff like that. I was always the one making the mixed CDs for road trips, um, and making sure that we had good music to listen to. And then when I met my husband, we were at a house party one night, and my brother actually had his Technique turntable set up and a mixer. And my husband said, "Oh, I know how to DJ." And I didn't know that about him. And so that night, I got to experience playing with vinyl and seeing how that kind of worked. And then he started really practicing a lot and got a couple club residencies. And so I just kept practicing and practicing, and I really fell in love with mixing music. And I just found that I had a natural talent for it. And I think that came from all of my years of piano. And my very first music class was a percussion class when I was really little. And I always really appreciated like beats and just putting music together, which is why I liked making mixtapes. Um, and so the two of us started a residency together called Shake and Pop. And it was an electronic night. And at the time, electronic music was still pretty fringe. And
When
it,
is this roughly?
this was in 2000, let's see, this would have been 2009.
Okay.
And um, so it was really fun. We got to open for a lot of really amazing artists, and we got to see a lot of incredible talent in small venues, mostly because, it was still like a small draw for a lot of these artists. And so it was a really cool time. And we, at one point, held 3 residencies every week. And so we were DJing like 5, 6 nights a week. And it definitely took a toll, but we were we were like the nightlife kids, we were running around doing all the nightlife stuff. And then I got pregnant. And when we became parents, it was like, I don't know that working until 3 a.m. is so conducive to raising a child. Um, and so we were very, very intentional and thoughtful with what gigs we would accept. And we'd already been doing like runway shows together and fashion strolls and gallery strolls and, gallery openings, all kinds of things. And so it was easy to just pick and choose the things that felt right. And I still do that to this day. Like if it doesn't make sense to go out and do it, then I don't. Um, yeah, lots of memories of holding our turntables outside of the club at 3 a.m. waiting for a cab to come pick us up.
Uh,
Um, yeah, it was a really great time. And um, from there, my husband actually was a musician and touring through like Australia, New Zealand before we even met, and taught me how to produce in 2010. So we started producing together, and um, yeah, just started playing around and making music. And it wasn't until Onchain that I started to release solo music. And part of that was, you release in Web 2 and digital streaming platforms, and it's just like, where does it go? It kind of goes into the void. And so a lot of that work just went like unlistened to and unnoticed. And so when I started to release solo stuff, I was like, I'm just going to put it on chain first, and maybe I'll put it on DSPs, but we'll see. And so that was really fun. My first release was a song called Focus, and I released that on Zora. And then I released a song called Shake on Sound XYZ. And let's see, it's coming up on the anniversary because I got a club remix that I'm going to be dropping. Um, that was February of 2022. And through that, I had a partnership with MTV to do Mental Health Action Day, to do an activation for that, which was in May of 2022. And so I did uh, an event called Shake for Mental Health. And it's a somatic practice that helps release any tension or stress from the nervous system. It's a way to ground. It's I think we might have talked about this before, but it's something that mammals do, like in the wild. If they feel a threat, as soon as that threat is gone, they shake their body, and it
mm.
just gets it out of the nervous system. And that's something that I had learned from my mom through a book that she read many years ago. And so I was, kind of doing that practice on my own. Side note, I also was a professional Tahitian dancer for a few years, um, and did competitions and stuff. And so that element of shaking was already part of my practice. And once I
What's
learned how
Tahitian dancing?
Tahitian dancing is like the fast hip shaking from Tahiti. So if
Okay,
you go to like a luau or something, you'll see like the fast hip shaking.
got
Um,
it.
yeah.
And is
So
that's similar, or at least like tangential to the shake that you're talking about, and from like the so what would be the practice that you mentioned that sort of resembles this thing that like all mammals do? Uh, is that something that you're like doing shake? Is it like a specific practice that you're doing daily, or you're like applying it when certain, like a mammal might not do it daily, but if it's getting, chased by another animal or something and needs to
right.
shake it off, it shakes it off?
Yeah, exactly. I was very diligent about my Tahitian dance practice for a long time, and even like through pregnancy and stuff, I still did it to like stay mobile and make sure that I was like still moving and very fluid. And so I'll do it as part of a dance practice, not daily, but a few times a week at least. And then when I do feel my nervous system activated, I will like shake out my arms and my legs. Sometimes if I'm going through like high stress, or, you know, I can tell I'm in like a high stress time of life. When I wake up in the morning, I just shake out my arms and legs. I know it sounds weird, but it's like if you can see a dog do it, like they stand on all fours and they shake their whole body. Um, just doing something simple like that, like you can just literally shake it out of your body. And I learned that when I was in yoga teacher training, and when you're holding a static pose and like sometimes your arm or your leg will shake, it's just your nervous system releasing stress and trauma. And so when I put that together, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I've done a lot of research about it now, and like the the practice of it, there's a lot of scientific evidence about how beneficial it is for mental health and, emotional health, and just in general, it's really good for us to do.
Yeah,
So I
it's
thought,
pretty cool. I feel like I just like acquired this new tool where like it's not a hard, I mean, I'm sure there's maybe guidance on like how best to do it, but like anyone can sort of, you can at least, have a go at a shake and see how, like, give it your best. Like you said, like you can sort of like when you're talking about animals doing it, I can sort of visualize whether it's dog or some other animal, like you kind of just can, what it is. They just like sort of shake it off, literally.
Yeah. Exactly.
And to like but that's also not something like you mentioned. Some people might, shake their leg or something, but it's like not something that people really intentionally do, unless you sort of have this piece of knowledge that it actually can be like sort of a useful thing to do. And so now I'm just like, shake has been added to my repertoire of things that I can do. And
Yes.
it's like, it's quick and it's easy and it's kind of fun. So I'm definitely intrigued. I gave, as I'm walking, as we're talking, I gave a couple, I gave a couple arm shakes, I tried a little full body. It's a little, I don't know. It's like hard while I'm walking. I probably need to like relax and, fully commit to the shake, but it's fun even just like doing that. And I feel like it's a nice thing, a nice tool to have in the arsenal.
Yeah.
And the other thing
Absolutely.
is, what wasn't that, did you say that wasn't Shake the name of your, like when you were DJing with your husband, wasn't it Shake and Pop or something?
Yes. I love that you picked up on that because I just a few months picked up on that. I was like, wait a minute. That's kind of been a theme.
So they
I
weren't like connected, like fully?
no. My
Interesting.
song Shake, it's funny. I wanted to make a song. As soon as I started learning how to produce, I wanted to incorporate Tahitian drums because there's such a unique tone and texture and drum pattern to that sound. And so I wanted to incorporate that into a song. And I sat on the idea for years. And as songwriting often is, pieces of it will come. And then later on, it's like the rest will come. Sometimes it's a sit down and it's one and done in the moment. But a lot of times it comes in stages. And that was one of those songs that did that. And I had been invited to drop on Sound. At the time, it was still curated. It wasn't an open platform yet. And I thought, it's time for me to make this song. And it's time to like share this side of myself. It's rooted in who I am. Like I said, my first music class was a percussion class. Drums and percussive instruments have always been a big part of like my love for music. And so I recorded the samples and I listened to one of my old practice songs as reference so that I could kind of emulate the same textures and tones in the sounds that I was sculpting. But yeah, I sampled my voice, I sampled all kinds of different instruments and things to make that song. And it was meant to be like honoring that piece of my personal history and my journey. When I was a Tahitian dancer and I was going to class and we were preparing for competition, our choreographer, his mother would come to every practice, and she was a native Tahitian, and she had this really beautiful accent. She was like in her 70s, and she would go around and she would just like tap us on the hips and say, "You need to get your shake," and she would just
Yeah.
constantly tell us, like, "You need to get your shake," and it was hard. It was really hard. Like, move your hips that fast. And so I would go home after like these 3-hour rehearsals and just practice and practice and practice. And finally, it's like, it felt like chains fell and like it was like starting a lawnmower. It's like you keep pulling on it. You're trying to get that lawnmower to start and finally the engine revs.
Mm.
That's how it felt. And then once it unlocked, I was able to move like so freely. And it was really eye-opening for me. And I realized, wow, we really hold a lot of stress in our body, so much tension. And that's part of why I wanted to share like that song. That music was so important in my own life. I feel like the somatic practice of shaking is so important. And it was something that I wanted reflected in the music as well. And so that's where the lyrics "Got to get that shake" came from. It's like, got to shake it out.
Yeah, this would be we're talking about the different styles of podcasts earlier. This would be an extremely good time for me to insert the song that we're talking about here if I was mixing it up a little bit. But and that's the benefit of like I feel like you can I've heard a couple, for what it's worth, I've heard a couple of like a couple interesting podcasts come to mind. And one was, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was well, so here's another the interesting segue, but the podcast that I'm thinking of was Rick Rubin and Tyler Cowen, and they did are you familiar with this at all by any chance?
No, I'm excited
Yeah,
to hear
so
about them.
I guess Tyler Cowen, are you familiar with him at all?
No.
Okay, so he's like this I actually don't really know. I guess he's a professor at George Washington. George Washington has this Mercatus Center that, like, I don't really know what the deal is with it exactly, but they have at least a few people who have come out of it that were interested in working on things like charter cities, which has been a relatively long interest of mine. Like, how can we sort of experiment with new small cities and different policies and laws and just designs and basically change twist a couple of knobs on the way that existing cities and countries work, whether it's from like a regulatory perspective or again, like how it's designed. This isn't a charter city, but there's a, startup in Arizona that's experimenting with like, can we build a town or a city that doesn't have cars, called cul-de-sac. And then there's, other ones that are, there's Prospera in Honduras, which is more along the lines of a charter city that's experimenting with different, like, I think they have some regulatory differences on like basically they bought some land from Honduras and got some semblance of sovereignty to create their own rules in certain areas. So like they might not be able to change the crime laws in Honduras, but for their territory they might have to follow the Honduran law or whatever, but they can do some different things in terms of like biotech. So you can go there for like various treatments that you can't get in Honduras or even the U.S. or potentially, maybe anywhere else in the world. I'm not really sure the exact details. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but it's a very interesting concept for me because, first of all, it allows for much greater experimentation and competition amongst places to live, which obviously is a huge impact on those who live in them. And then secondarily, you could sort of learn from all of those experiments. People are opting in to move to these, new charter cities or experimental cities, whatever you want to call them. And from those people who opt into these experiments, like you could have one that, for example, outlaws sugar. And like, so it's, there's no sugar in that zone. So anytime you go to the supermarket or whatever, like you don't have to worry about, like if you never want to eat sugar again, you can, and that's really important to you, you can just move there. And then you can have studies of these people over a long period of time. You can be like, man, like sugar is really, really bad. These people are all living until 110 or whatever. And like, they're not even doing anything differently. So I just think it's a really interesting concept, which then after, some years of seeing how all of these different places end up and how they're doing, you can then draw upon those lessons and apply them to larger existing countries like, the US. And there's some precedents here for, like China has drawn upon the example of quasi charter cities, like there's Shenzhen. I think they've taken lessons from the success of Hong Kong and even Singapore. So it's a really interesting space. Anyway, that's a very long tangent. That is to sort of introduce Tyler Cowen, who's like sort of the guy at this Mercatus Center. And more generally, I think he's just kind of like a tech forward intellectual. He writes a lot of essays and blogs and stuff. And I guess he's also like sort of I think he's obsessed with music, basically, especially maybe classical music. And so he went on Rick Rubin's podcast. I will tie this full circle. He went on Rick Rubin's podcast and he was basically like, I mean, Rick Rubin obviously knows his music, and somehow Tyler Cowen like was on there bringing him through like almost like a music lesson of like all of his favorite songs. And then they would like play the song on the podcast because I guess Rick Rubin can kind of get the rights for whatever he wants, probably.
I'm sure, yeah.
And so they're like playing all these songs, and then after each song or clip of a song, they're talking about it. And it was really interesting. And I actually emailed Tyler Cowen after, who I've had like a couple back and forth emails over the years. And I was like, how, if you don't mind sharing, like, do you know how you guys did that? Like, did he go through with, like, did he have to get the rights for all of these things, or did you guys just like send it? Like, how did that work? Cause I would love to do podcasts with music sort of intertwined. And he was like, I don't really know. You'd have to ask Rick. And I'm not going to connect you to Rick. He didn't think
You're like, well, let me just hit him up.
yeah. I was like, well, you got his number? No, but I didn't ask. He was just like, basically, I don't know. So anyway, that was an interesting sort of example. And there's a couple other podcasts that I think of over time. But anyway, I wanted to use this. After thinking of this randomly, I realized that you have an amazing Rick Rubin story. So maybe you can. I've read your essay, and we've talked about it a little bit in written form, but we haven't talked about it live. So maybe you could tell the story for those who aren't familiar. And it's just an awesome story, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those that, even thinking about it, I get chills on my arms. It was so wild. It kind of started, I'll start at the beginning. So before my family left for this trip, I took out my book, The Creative Act, Way of Being, the book by Rick Rubin, and I will just kind of flip through it. And a lot of times I'll open it and see, like, what do I need to read, in this moment? And it's often exactly what I need to hear. Like one that I'm kind of sitting with right now, I opened the book a few days ago, and it was on greatness. And then, of course, somehow the Matrix picks it up and starts serving any content related to greatness. But I took a picture because it said sometimes I don't want to butcher the quote. Let me pull it up so I don't destroy it.
Yeah, I'm usually I'll stall for you. I'm usually one to just go right for it and butcher the quote, but I do feel, and I'm not afraid to butcher really anyone's quote, but I do feel like, especially given the story upcoming, like you want to get the quote right for Rick Rubin.
Yeah, right. It's got to be right for him. But I did that practice the night before my family left, and I was like, I really need this reminder because I have a tendency to say that I'm not going to work, and then when I'm on vacation, I still do.
Yeah.
In fact, like in the middle of launching Higher FM last August, I was actually on a family vacation, and I remember like having to miss a couple things because like, oh, I gotta submit some things, I gotta do this, but I'll catch up with you later. And I didn't want to do that, and so I did a huge sprint like toward the middle of December. Like that was my goal. Like I've got to be done with everything so that I can actually unplug and take a solid vacation. And I flipped open the book the night before we left and read, "Sometimes disengaging is the best way to engage." And I took a picture of it because I knew I needed that reminder while I was gone. I deleted Warpcast off my phone. I was just like, nope, I'm gonna focus and be present because I know like this is important.
You were really serious. If you delete Warpcast, that's when you know it's a proper unplug.
Yeah, I was so serious. And I was just like, experiencing just an incredible time with family. And it was the first trip of its kind where my entire family was there. And it was really beautiful. And we were doing all these really fun adventures and just having a great time together. And part of the family left, and then my family stayed like an extra almost week. And so we were able to explore a little bit more and just take it at a slower pace and just really enjoy things, slow living. And it was like a Thursday, and I thought, I want to go back to Honolulu. There's supposed to be like road construction next week. So what if we go on Sunday? And it was like, cool. Yeah, let's plan on going on Sunday. Sunday rolled around. It was a beautiful day. The last time we had been in Honolulu, it was really rainy and cloudy and incredibly crowded because it was just like holiday time. And Um, it was just a beautiful drive up there. Everything was just like so serene and calm, and there wasn't traffic. And it was just one of those magical days where, in hindsight, it's like, wow, everything really unfolded as it should, you know?
Hmm.
So we got up there, and my husband and my kiddo wanted some pizza. And since I have celiac, I was like, why don't you find a slice while we're up here? You know, go, there's some pizza places, like go find a slice. So we found this little area where they had restaurants and shopping mixed in. And um, I saw this little music store that had crates outside. And so, of course, being a turntable DJ, loving vinyls, I was like, let me go see if I can find any gems. And you would think that's where I met Rick Rubin, but it wasn't. Flipping through the vinyls, they're eating their pizza. I was supposed to walk across the street and get myself something to eat kind of at the same time so we could all be done around the same time. And I just got lost in the vinyls, and I'm flipping through every single one just to make sure no stone is unturned here. And I didn't really find anything. It was like, there's some stuff that I was like, oh, that could be great, but I don't know that I want to risk trying to get a vinyl home on an airplane. So I'll just skip it. And I thought, okay, I turned over every single vinyl. Now I can go get myself something to eat. So I walked across the street by myself and went to this market. And as soon as I walk up the steps, Rick Rubin was standing in the doorway at the register. And I just stood there like kind of in shock. Like, is this real? What, like, and I don't really get starstruck. I've had the opportunity to meet like a lot of celebrities and be in company with people that I don't really feel that. I know that we're all human and doing the best we can. And so I was a little surprised at how stunned I was and just standing there. And I thought, I have to say something. And so I just lightly touched his arm as he walked by, and I just said, thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for your book. As a musician and producer, it really inspires me, and I really appreciate all of the work you do. And he stopped and smiled and said, oh, thank you so much, and kept walking. And that was it. And I was just like shaking. My nervous system was literally shaking. And I went to order some food at the back of the market, and I was standing there. My husband came in, and I was just like, so I just met Rick Rubin. Like, what? How? Where? And it was just one of those like magical moments. And as I looked back on it, it was very serendipitous. Like, had anything changed, had I gone to the market first instead of stopping to flip through the vinyl, would I have met him? I don't know. It was one of those things. And it was it felt like a very personal affirmation. I had been wrestling a lot with, just in full transparency, I had been wrestling a lot with putting my own music and projects on the back burner while I was launching and working on Higher FM. And so toward the end of the year, I was starting to really feel that, and like, I need to get back into my own expression and complete, some music projects that I've had going, and make sure what I'm putting out next year, it's for me as well. It's not just building for community, but it's also like, I need this for my own expression. And so taking a picture of that reminder to disengage and really fill my cup with inspiration and being present, that's the best way to have your own thoughts and your own expression and your own creations, is when it comes from the inspiration that you receive from your environment. And so I knew like that was going to be an important trip for me, to just really fill my cup with inspiration and relaxation and fun and joy and play and all the things that kind of get lost when we get back into the grind of things. And to see him, like, it was just like this perfect bookend of the trip. It was like, go home and remember how you felt, remember what your goals are, um, remember what you want to do. And it just felt like an affirmation to create. And so I really, really appreciated that. And yeah, I've been trying to hold on to that. And I will say the first day I got home, wrote a new song. So it's coming.
That's awesome. It's really an incredible story, and there's just some things that happen once in a while. Like you go through your day to day life, things are relatively normal. Good things happen, bad things happen, whatever. And then once in a while, you have something like that that is just like this is just a little bit too much for coincidence for me. Like it's you open the page, you got the exact quote that you need to see at that time. And maybe there's a few other quotes you could have seen at that time that would have resonated similarly, but that's pretty darn good, like to what, you needed or were looking to do at that time. And then you go and like, you're flipping through vinyls right before you met him, which is like, and you don't meet him at the music store. Like there's
Right.
all these like random things that are, like you said, anything could have been different and it wouldn't have happened. You decide to buy one of those records and you probably just miss them. Um, and you get to have a quick exchange of words with him. That sounded like it was, doesn't need to be a super long conversation to be incredibly impactful and meaningful. And it sounds like what you sort of had and did was pretty perfect. And it's just awesome when stuff like that happens. It can, I think, if you're looking to fill back up your cup, just like, the whole trip can be great, but even just a moment like that or, sequence of moments like that can instantaneously fill a cup, even if the rest of the week was sort of like a write-off.
Yeah, absolutely. It can, and it really can change things for a long time going forward because it can set you back on your path so quickly. It gets you right back on track. Like, oh, yeah, this is important. This is an important part of who I am and what makes me happy. And at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. We need to hold on to our joy because it absolutely can be sucked right out of us in no time. Hop on social media and your joy can be drained from you in like 5 seconds. And that's something that has to be protected and guarded. And one thing I learned as a new parent, was it's so hard to play sometimes. As an adult, you get so used to like, what's the end result or why am I doing this? You kind of get into these routines and habits. And even if they are joyful and pleasurable and bring fulfillment, just playing for the sake of playing, I found it really difficult. And I had to work toward that and then really go into some self inquiry like, why is it hard to play? And a lot of it is societal conditioning. When you're a kid, it's play. And then as you start to go through junior high and high school, it's like, okay, get a little more serious now. Like, let's start focusing. Playing is for kids. There's some of those messages that are kind of woven into society. And so I think it's really important to find opportunities to play. And it's something that I have to remind myself to do. I get very serious and I take myself very seriously, even though I'm a total jokester and I have a quick wit and I love making people laugh. I also like have to really remind myself to not take things so seriously and to play.
Yeah, it's a challenging balance. I'm similar, I would say, in that I want to spend, and I would say do spend a good amount of my time doing what I consider to be playing. This podcast is basically playing, and basically doing anything for the thing rather than as a means to some end. Or if it is a means to an end in some, to some degree, some part of it is a means to an end. It's like you're at least open-ended as to what that end might be. Whereas like if you're doing X to get Y, I feel like it's usually not play. I think there's an element of play that involves either doing the thing for the sake of the thing or doing the thing without any prescription for like what should come of it. And so I try to do a lot of that, but at the same time, like I'm pretty serious. Like I'm pretty serious overall. I mean, I want to, my sort of North Star for how to live is a seeming like I like to use the word worthwhile. So I like to do things that are worthwhile, that seem worthwhile. And it can seem like a very low bar from one perspective, because there's a ton of things that, in one sense of the word, worthwhile are worthwhile, like way too many to do in a lifetime. But when I try to use that word in a way that means, that has like sort of the full context. So it's like worthwhile in the context that I only have so much time and I can only do so many things. Is this worthwhile?
Mm-hmm.
And those things can be like super random. And I appreciate like sort of diversity amongst those things. Not diversity for the sake of diversity, but most people get on a track and they might, take a left turn here and a right turn there, but they're kind of on the same road. And I think it's interesting to just like sort of lift off and plop yourself somewhere new and then like start navigating from there and then lift up again and plop yourself somewhere else. And it sounds like you've definitely done this with all of the sort of stops that you've made along the way. There's definitely themes, but it's all, I mean, it's a lot of it is within this performance and music and radio sort of realm, conversational realm, art realm, but it's not like you learned how to play piano and just kept playing piano for the rest of your life. Like these are like
Right.
pretty different routes that you've gone down. And I'm curious, actually, a question I meant to ask earlier, as you're like sort of at the peak of, performing in nightclubs and all that, are you, like you mentioned Salt Lake City earlier for the radio station, are you doing all of this or a lot of this there? Are you in different places throughout this story?
Mostly in Salt Lake City. As far as like the performance and stuff like that, is that what you mean?
Yeah, like when you're, because you've had different chapters and most of them have occurred within Salt Lake City. Like when you guys were at your busiest with, 3 a.m. waiting for the cab with your turntables, that's all
Yeah.
Salt Lake City.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's how I was picturing it, but I wanted to make sure, I'm not like this assumption that I have in my head is not like totally off and you're like bouncing all over the place during all of this.
Yeah. That's mostly where it happened. And then it was funny because we kind of felt like we hit the cap, we hit the ceiling. And that was part of just realizing like we've kind of done everything we can do in this city. And that was part of why we started traveling. We, took a sabbatical and we're like, what if we just like stop doing all of it? We're producing a lot of events and um, facilitating a lot of things. I had one event that I did was called Nightlife Yoga, where my husband would DJ and I would teach yoga. And this was in 2015. And it was really well received and it exploded really quickly. And it wasn't the right partnership with the other teacher that I had joined forces with. And so it kind of like came to a head where it was like, we got to that T stop sign. It was like, take a right or a left. And I was like, I feel like we need to go, we went separate ways and it worked out. And now I'm at the point where I see all of these themes. To your point, I can see how they kind of connect. And that's where I've been noticing the last few months. Like you noticed right away, Shake and Pop. That's like my song called Shake. It wasn't until I was listing all the projects that I've worked on that I realized the theme. So I had to sit down and like put the list in front of me. And now I can see what pieces I can weave together, which is, something that I want to focus on this next year. And yeah, so we had taken a sabbatical and like figure out where do we want to be, what feels right for us, where can we, be the most creative, what's best for our family. And we were traveling around and just enjoying life and very free and, able to play, spend most of the day just playing. Um, and then the pandemic hit. And so we were like, all right, well, we got to figure out a place to quarantine, I guess. Um, And so it's kind of funny to see, like, we just, like, boomeranged right back to where we were, but with a different perspective. And yeah, it's funny how life will do that sometimes. You'll go take a roundabout to come back to the same place where you were, but you needed to learn something along that roundabout, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So I know we're over the scheduled time. I have one more super random question and
Right.
one more uh more relevant question. The random one, it popped in my head earlier and then I forgot to ask because I just got you know, sucked into the story, but and there's more interesting parts after this part. But you mentioned like flipping through the vinyls and obviously there's a bit of a higher threshold on deciding to buy it when you have to transport it via flight and whatnot on the way back. But I was just curious as you were describing that as someone who has done this countless times, like what are you looking for? Like this place obviously has tons of vinyls. Like you're looking for something, you might not know what that is, but like from your history of digging through the crates, what's your like filter or process, or is it just kind of random and you see one that you like and decide to pull it?
That's a good question. I think a part of it um, is I'm a very feeling person. So a lot of it is I'll see something, I like the artwork, and then I start to investigate, especially a lot of times the crates will be artists that maybe aren't mainstream, so you're not as familiar with who they are.
Right.
Uh, and see, like, are there any song titles that pop out at me? When was it recorded? Where was it recorded? What year? So a lot of times I think samples, there's so much to be said about samples. Um,
Are you
but
primarily looking for samples when you're doing that, like as opposed to expecting to, like you're not as much looking for a record that you're going to enjoy countless times front to back as much as you're looking for something with like a piece of gold in it?
a little bit of both. So it's not always like sample digging. Sometimes it's like, what does this body of work sound like start to finish? I
Right.
think it's really interesting to pick something up and like, why did they put these songs together? Because it's storytelling. At the end of the day, a full album is storytelling. Um, and I think the process can maybe be likened a little bit to picking wine. Like, unless somebody has recommended it to you, or maybe you've tasted it somewhere else, like you could walk in somewhere and kind of like that label, and you start to get a little curious about it. A lot of times I think it's visual first. Um, and then, yeah, and then I start to notice something that piques my interest, whether it's, like I said, the copyright, like if it's, this is from 1968. Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, what would they have recorded? Like, that's going to have a really analog sound to it. And that could be really cool start to finish. Um, Sometimes looking for gems, like there was there was a Donna Summers album, there was a Chaka Khan album that I saw that I wasn't familiar with any of the songs, just like from the title. Probably could have been a really great listen start to finish, but if I were at home, I absolutely would have picked it up, you know? Um, so yeah, I think it's a lot of times it's visually first, and then what piques my interest as I start to kind of go through the song titles and read about it. One thing that I discovered in this particular instance was a lot of the albums had like some thoughtful paragraph or two on the back that shared why they created this body of work and what the intention was for it. And I thought that was really interesting because we don't get that a lot in music these days.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about everything. And the thing that resonates with me most is probably like I figured that, my version of what I would do. I haven't been, you know, going through records nearly as much like over my life, but yeah, from time to time, like I do have a record player, a bunch of records. And I feel like I don't really think about like the year. Mine is just like sort of simpler, and that's why I was curious, what would be like sort of the next things to do. Mine is kind of like, do I recognize the artist? That's like one thing, but assuming that I don't, I do feel like you can look at the cover, like you said, it starts as a visual thing. And I feel like it's surprising how often your like resonance with the taste of a cover, like the taste that the artist had in creating that. And who knows, like maybe it's not even them really determining that all the time, but even if it's people they're working with or whatever, like if you enjoy the taste of what they decided to make, like the cover, what the art looks like, it often translates to enjoying like, having a similar taste for the music.
Mhm.
And it's like it's a simple way to go about it, but I feel like it actually does work reasonably well. And so the last thing I was going to ask is, it sounds like the start of this year has been kind of like, a fresh start and clean slate to some degree. Obviously, you've got projects that are ongoing, but what's your sort of focus now, or, for the time to come? Are there certain things that you're thinking about a lot or acting on a lot or orienting yourself around for sort of the upcoming chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm creating my debut album. I've only released singles, and even in anything that I've released that I've co-produced or co-written, it's always been uh, oriented towards singles. And so I want to complete a body of work that I feel represents me and my expression. And um, yeah, that my debut album, which is kind of wild to say, and um, it's exciting because I'm thinking about like a lot of the moving parts, and I've had artwork exhibited in collective shows. I had a couple pieces, one at the World Trade Center last year and one at the Leonardo, which is a museum here in Salt Lake City. And I want to bring all aspects of my artistry together, whether that's performance art, recorded sound, or visually. And I want to do an exhibition of all of my work and see how these projects that I've created throughout time intersect. And my debut album is going to be like that connection point that alludes to the future and also is rooted in some of the things that I've done. And yeah, it can be like that connection point.
That's awesome. I love the confident, single focus answer, debut album. That's certainly something worth going all in on. And I can't wait to dig in. I'm not going to pressure you for any timeline or anything, but please let me know if I don't see it, organically. Add me to your list or whatever, to people to let know when it's live and out.
I
Would
will.
love to
Absolutely.
check it out.
Thank you. And then with regard to Higher FM, expanding the programming, got a couple shows that are going to be launching this year, new shows, two new hosts. And I actually have one in the works with myself and my husband. He's been my biggest creative partner. And so we're going to talk about our shared love of music and what music we, have played together and why, and some of our old club stories and some of the shenanigans we used to get into, and just kind of see where that goes. But yeah, with Higher FM, it's going to be expanding into more programming, and hopefully I'll get a little more support on the back end, on the production end.
Yeah, maybe there's someone who would be interested in lending their support. Maybe someone will listen to this. I found on Farcaster especially, it's like a relatively small network, obviously, but there's just so many people who like want to work on interesting things that sort of put it out there, and sometimes the magnet pulls in the right persons.
Mhm.
So it would be cool if you can get a little bit of support for, it sounds like bigger and better future for Higher FM. And it's so is Higher FM will remain, like, I think of Higher FM, despite the name implying a station, as a show, but
Mhm.
it'll basically be Higher FM will sort of remain like a flagship show of Higher FM, which will have other shows on it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, assuming that it sort of aligns and is of a somewhat similar vibe to Higher FM, the show, I'm sure the station will come together great. So anyway, I want to thank you for taking the time and going well over the time. It's always a pleasure speaking. I was happy to, I hope this isn't, too much of a reveal, but I was happy to go on Higher FM a while ago and we recorded for that. And now to have you on Purple People, maybe we'll release them around the same time. But two awesome conversations. Very much enjoyed them.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much for having me on. And I think doing a dual release could be really cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna go give a shake and see
Yeah,
how the rest of my day goes.